Let's talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Um, I think in some ways I could see thinking that he was an anti-totalitarian. I've just reread The Social Contract. Uh, I can see thinking that he was a totalitarian. So those kinds of that's the kind of thing that might make you wonder about his competence. As I keep returning to that theme. Perhaps I shouldn't in this way uh, impugn the competence of the great philosophers. But I do think Rousseau is a mess. Okay, like does he contradict himself? Could you have a right wing interpretation and a left wing interpretation of Rousseau equally supported by the text? Could you have a Hobbesian and a Lockean and a Marxist and an anarchist readings of Rousseau that could be sustained by the text? I think so. I mean, so the argumentative ingenuity and consistency that I was attributing to Hobbes is notably absent in Rousseau. But those are not the only things that one might wish for in a philosopher, of course. And also, the period is different here. Okay, what are Rousseau's years? 1718 to 1712 to 1778. Right. Rousseau is a pivotal figure in the intellectual history of Europe in a way that even Hobbes is not, let's say. And one way he represents a pivot is into romanticism. I mean, these are familiar points. Hobbes is grinding the arguments, boom, 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 like he wants to knock you down. And even Locke is doing that, like trying to give you decisive arguments. In fact, I think Locke's response to Hobbes is decisive, rationally decisive. Because rational people in the state of nature wouldn't constitute an absolute sovereignty because they wouldn't want to be its victims. Okay. So Locke is, all right, but Rousseau is doing something else, I guess. He appears to be making arguments and really in the same social contract tradition as Hobbes and Locke famously. But it's more like he's writing as he emotes volcanically. Okay? Like, this is the pivot into romanticism, man. Like, this is a completely different voice and much more personal, for one thing. He's always showing his own, apparently, I guess, showing his own struggles and so I guess, all right, so for a long time, I regarded Rousseau, I probably said this in political philosophy classes that I taught, as the founder of the left, the founding figure of the left. Because I don't think you really have sensible left right that that has any purchase in reality up until the French Revolution, basically. And you can see maybe the left and right ideas sort of gathering force in the lead up to the revolution. Rousseau is absolutely key to the revolution, the French Revolution. Like, I really think that the inspiring effect of Rousseau on the French Revolution was decisive, or partly decisive. Now, whether that was because it's for the Republican Revolution at the beginning or the terror, both of those kind of make sense in a Rousseau way. Maybe that was a pretty Rousseauvian terror in the French Revolution, Robespierre and so on. But it's hard to say because he said all kinds of stuff. He made all kinds of arguments. This is, I mean, it's not surprising that he drove his contemporary Hume up the wall. They knew each other. They're opposite kinds of arguers. Hume is just a fastidious logician, and Rousseau is more like trying to contain in the text, like I say, the kind of volcanic passions that lead to it are obviously kind of like constrained in the mountain of these texts. Also, I guess I'm basically going one book for each figure, and this is more problematic with regard to Rousseau than most, because if you said that this is not, the social contract is not that compatible with Emile, okay, or Confessions, or or the Discourse on Inequality, you'd have a point. They're all connected. They all have the same temperament, the same sensibility, but all of them are very casual about any specific positions, if you ask me. How they hang together. Yeah, so I used to think of him as the founder of the left for reasons I'll try to describe. And rereading this now, I kind of think that he's more like the founder of 19th century politics, left and right. And the decisive move, and here he's intensifying Hobbes and Locke, and Montesquieu, and he has all this on board too, and to some extent encyclopedias and so on. Collective identities in this whole period, modern political theory. We're starting with Hobbes on that, is focused on the creation, the identification of collective identities. And a gigantic issue is which. All right. So Hobbes' Leviathan is a collective identity, as depicted again in the frontispiece, all of us together in a single commonwealth. All of us together forming an individual, which is, by the way, is also Plato's vision of this, that the polis is analogous to an individual. All right. But Rousseau works this in a very constant, fundamental way, okay? And it's the concept of the general will. All right. Which he thinks of the general will is the sovereign of a Rousseau commonwealth, polis, nation, state. Right. And he's ecstatic about it, ecstatic about this collective identity. And he's really interested in the question of whether and how and to what extent and in what manner we retain our individual identities when we enter into collective identities. All right. So, right, he calls it the general will, and the idea that the legitimacy of a government or a state rests on the will of the people has never been kind of more. No one has ever committed themselves to that idea more fully than Rousseau. All right, but then all kinds of funky shit happens after that. That sounds like a democratic move. And to some extent, he's more sympathetic with democracy than almost anyone in the 18th century. Like, he has more somewhat positive things to say about it. Although mixed and obscure, too, by the end. All right, so I guess just to pay off a little bit on this idea that he's the founding figure of the 19th century, collective identities, I think, are the absolute the ground zero of political debate in the 19th and also to a large extent in the 20th century. What are the general wills? In Rousseau, it's everyone. It's the citizens assembled. Right? So this is one reason why I'm saying maybe not left or right per se. Because I think as the left-right schism develops, and develops between, and gets ever more sympathy with autocratic and totalitarian systems, both of them, the right and the left, the clearest way to put their disagreement, apparent disagreement, is what are the basic collective agents? Nations or social classes, for example. So, and this, again, like romanticism is developing and it's coming right out of Foucault, in a way, okay, partly, many other figures too. But, and nationalism is rising. Nationalism is not necessarily like a obvious, natural, inevitable position. It rises into dominance, and it starts making wars extremely in the 19th century. And figures like Herder or Hegel have all kinds of nationalist stuff going on, all right? And they probably feel right-wing, as to the extent that anyone in 1820 can really feel right-wing, or 1810. If you and I think this is one reason again why I'm sort of withdrawing this left-wing Rousseau a little bit. It's awfully close to nations in here. His general wills. We form nations, I think. I mean, he says things like, a general will is a polity. Everyone should have the same language in common. Everyone should recognize each other and stuff like this. Like, it sounds a little like racial, ethnic uniformity is one of the aspects, and that would give you this kind of right-wing nationalist totalitarianism or war, etc. Or just love of the state because it's our state. We, the French, the Czechs, I don't know what, all right, the Americans, the Pennsylvanians. All right. So Rousseau, I think, first one reason he's definitely worth doing here is because he shows the nascent spirit of 19th and 20th century totalitarianisms. Yay. Left and right. I'll talk about collective agents as a problematic thing, or what the alternative might be, but maybe not in this series. Okay. So now, how does a general will form for Rousseau? What's it like to be part of a general will? This is the totalitarian moment. Kind of, this thing is reduced to some extent by the end. But, so let's go through some of these very famous passages. Here's the problem. Look, he goes back to Hobbes in a lot of ways. But actually it's just kind of, to me, he's just like kind of thrashing around. But he goes back to the worst aspects of Hobbes and gets his totalitarian flavor from that in part. But he intensifies it too in like this really pointed way. How to find, I'm on page 60 of my little edition, this is chapter 6 of book 1 of The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. How to find a form of association which will defend the person and goods of each member with the collective force of all. Hobbes might have said that, Locke might have said that. And under which each individual, while uniting himself with the others, obeys no one but himself and remains as free as before. This is the fundamental problem to which the social contract holds the solution. And this, I say, is the fundamental contribution. It's not completely original, but it's like highly intensified and pointedly explored by Rousseau. That in a state where law prescribes many of your actions and the sovereign limits your individual will in many ways, you are perfectly free. Perfectly free. So this is the great intellectual challenge of Rousseau, and it's the great effect of Rousseau on Kant. Rousseau is fundamental to Kant's political and ethical philosophy, and Hegel, and classical liberalism as it developed. That, I mean, it's a remarkable paradox. In my opinion, it's ridiculous. But the idea is that, or it's just like obviously fictional, man. Okay, it's the lawgiver of yourself. Freedom, to be free is to be the lawgiver of yourself. And he says that, and he says it in the most explicit and repetitive terms. And that is the fundamental idea of classical liberalism as it developed. In Kant, you'll see signs of that all over Rawls, for instance. You'll see it. It's the basic idea in Habermas as well, like the classical liberal idea that to be free is to be the lawgiver of yourself, and to be free in the Rousseau way is to enter into a social contract which erases the individual will. He's real obscure about this on and off, but man, that's what he says though too. And makes and leaves you free to do what the state tells you to do. Okay, or at least okay. So no degree of, I mean, you know, if you can reconcile yourself to the laws of the government around you, no degree of oppression will reduce your freedom at all. I have done some videos on this. These conceptions of freedom in the West are amazing, right? The desperation with which they will defend oppression as freedom is astounding. Kant being the most beautiful example, you know. But these liberals, man, like, anyway, you got to hear this. Like, you got, anyway. These articles of association, rightly understood, the social contract, rightly understood, are reducible to a single one, article of association, namely the total alienation of each associate of himself and all his rights to the community. Okay, so that is at least apparently a Hobbesian rather than a Lockean move on this. And I'm not counting Locke as a totalitarian, but I am counting Hobbes. And, you know, to help make my case on Rousseau, the fact that he runs all that way with Hobbes is shocking for someone who is thought of as this liberatory figure like Rousseau was in the 18th century. But there it is, man. Like, you give up all your rights. You give up, and this is the great Rousseau thought. You give up all your rights. And that doesn't reduce your freedom at all. This is one of the most remarkable moments in intellectual history, because it's the most ridiculous moment in intellectual history of Immanuel Kant. It's the again, this is temperamentally, no one could be more different than Kant and Rousseau. Okay, but the basic idea in Kant's political and ethics political philosophy and ethics comes from Rousseau. And he acknowledges that too, Kant does. Um, since the alienation is unconditional, the union is as perfect as it could be, and no individual associate has any longer any rights to claim. For if rights were left to individuals, in the absence of any higher authority to judge between them and the public, each individual, being his own judge in some cases, would soon demand to be his own judge in all. And in this way, the state of nature would be kept in being, and the association inevitably become either tyrannical or void. Okay, and I mean, he's arguing, as someone like Rousseau probably doesn't really have the equipment to argue, but someone like Kant does, an a priori argument, that the whole thing will break down if you are left with any individual rights or autonomy of any sort. Except you're perfectly autonomous, because you'll be giving yourself the laws that we are offering you as enforced by our army. He says that too. It's the armed forces that are going to accomplish this general will. If then we eliminate from the social pact everything that is not essential to it, we find it comes down to this. Each one of us puts into the community his person and all his powers under the supreme direction of the general will, and as a body of the supreme direction of the general will. And as a body, we incorporate every member as an indivisible part of the whole. Immediately, in place of the individual person of each contracting party, this act of association creates an artificial and collective body composed of as many members as there are voters in the assembly. It's just a Leviathan. Like I say, it's probably a little shocking to some of Rousseau's readers by the time he gets here. So I guess I got various things. This shows the totalitarian implications of collective identities. It shows the possibly totalitarian undertow of various forms of classical liberalism once you got to Kant, Habermas. I mean, I don't want to accuse, I'm not going to do an episode of Kant or Habermas. If you're a sincere classical liberal, you don't have a totalitarian politics. But what you have at your very heart is an absurd, obviously false position that has totalitarian implications. And that is that if you give yourself the rules that we're imposing on you, if you absorb them fully enough, if you're permeated enough by our authority, you are perfectly free. That's why we need Michel Foucault, dude, to talk about this era, the classical era, he calls it. As the sovereign, this is chapter 7, the sovereign of book 1 of the social contract. As the sovereign is formed entirely of the individuals who compose it, it has not, nor could it have, any interest contrary to theirs. Now, the sovereign sounds like a Hobbesian king, but, and he makes this clear as he keeps going. The sovereign is the general will. The sovereign is the people. But but he keeps saying things like the general will is infallible, and so, and the idea that I cannot have any. Look, the trafficking in fictions is just so palpable, so obvious. It's kind of crazy. The sovereign is formed entirely of the individuals who compose it. It cannot have any interest contrary to theirs. Therefore. And so the sovereign has no need to give guarantees to his subjects. To the subjects. Because it's impossible for a body to wish to hurt all of its members. And as we shall see, it cannot hurt any particular member. The sovereign power cannot hurt you no matter what it does, including executing you. The sovereign, by the mere fact that it is always what it ought to be. Indicating no limits whatsoever on sovereign power. This is a sovereign absolutism, at least early on in this book. Okay. Wow, it's a nightmare. Right? And he thinks all this follows by definitions and stuff like this, but the arguments are so half-assed, dude. Like Kant knew this, among others. It's impossible for a body to wish to hurt all its members. Like he throws out principles like that without any justification, and like you just go like, what? I mean, like I could try to commit suicide or something. I don't know. I have no idea what you're talking about, man. It's impossible for a body to wish to hurt any of its members. That's the principle by which he concludes that it's impossible for the general will to harm anybody. Right? The arguments are terrifyingly bad. Right? But I mean, like I say, like that's maybe it's not the. It's holding him to a standard of argumentative ingenuity, validity, and stuff like that is kind of a misconstrual of his project. And so then we get this very famous passage. Hence, in order that the social pact shall not be an empty formula, it is tacitly implied that the commitment, which alone can give force to all the others, that whoever refuses to obey the general will, shall be constrained to do so by the whole body, which means nothing more than he shall be forced to be free. This is if I said that this was the most repulsive moment in the history of Western philosophy, I probably have said that about some other ideas, but this one really gets me, man. Like, this idea that we don't reduce your freedom at all when we repress you and execute you and shit, and like, make it so you can't speak or, torture you to death. We're not reducing your freedom at all. That's, it's beyond Orwell or whatever. And it's the idea at the heart of classical liberalism. But the collective identities that we're just throwing around willy-nilly, nations, races, classes, what's it going to be, man? So that's one big problem with collective identities. I have a whole bunch of them, right? Which one's it going to be? We'll try to work that out a little bit. But what if you're going to limit me to one collective identity, like only my nation, only my class, only my race signifies, you're going to have to totalitarianize me. Okay? You totalize me as a American, a white person, and hence master. So, I mean, here's just this quasi-famous footnote toward the end of the social contract. What is this part? Book 4. This is a footnote. Chapter 1 of book 4. In Genoa, he does this kind of like sort of Machiavellian thing where he's going everywhere and looking at all the texts supposedly or whatever. I think it's kind of thin though, looking at ancient history like Machiavelli, sort of quoting Machiavelli. In Genoa, the word libertas may be seen on the doors of all the prisons and on the fetters of the galleys. This use of the motto is excellent and just. To put liberty as the motto on a prison or on the fetters in the galleys, the manacles that tie you to the oars, In fact, it's only the malefactors of all states who prevent the citizens from being free. In a country where all such people were in the galleys, the most perfect liberty would be enjoyed. So that's just a nice little argument that our freedom is going to depend on your incarceration. But actually, your freedom will be enhanced by your incarceration too. Right? Because now you'll be free to do as the general will tells you to do. You can finally become the lawgiver of yourself. Now we'll go to some Beccaria prison reforms, some Bentham panopticons and stuff like this. Nice totalitarian moves. All right. Well, it is a durable covenant, he says, the social contract, because it is guaranteed by the armed forces and the supreme power. So long as the subjects to submit to such covenants, they obey nobody but their own will. It's amazing. What an amazing doctrine. Okay, our governments will be enforced by the armed forces. And when you obey no one but your own will. Even though there is a guy standing behind you with a sword who's going to behead you if you don't. That will be libertas. Liberty should be on that sword. That's how you get to the terror and shit like this. This is amazing. All right. Like I say, the leering parody of rationality, the grotesque, paradoxical crap that these people are selling you is amazing. And I mean Immanuel Kant, for one. Lawgiver of yourself bullshit. Do I even have to refute that? Okay? Libertas on the sword that executes you. All right, so that's Rousseau, maybe fundamental to right-wing and left-wing totalitarians that emerge in the, especially toward the end of the 19th century and into the 20th. Because you need some of these technologies, I think, to make a full totalitarian nightmare real. Plato didn't have the technology. Hobbes didn't have the technology. And Rousseau didn't have the technology. But Stalin had the technology. Right? And it's getting better every day.